Hi, my name is Paul Garcia, and I'm a student at National University, and this is my reflection video for my assessment practices inventory for AAL Class 656. Um, this is our second assessment, and as part of my growth process, 3 months ago in the middle of December, we took this inventory, and I'll compare that inventory to what I just finished up today on March 10th, 2019. So back on December 16th of 2018, under the category of clear purpose, when it came to my knowledge and use of assessments in my classroom, I scored about a 1.75 was my average for clear purpose, and today it's at overall out of 4. I can identify the key users of information, of classroom assessment information, and use that to help them meet their needs. I understand formative and assessments, formative and summative assessments, and I use them and know when to use them. And I understand the impact of formative assessment practices on student achievement. A lot of that has come out of AAL 652 and 654. For clear learning targets, my average score back in December was about 75% of 1, and now my average here was 3.5 for clear learning targets. And those were the categories of I can classify the learning targets. I went from a 1 to a 3 that I'm teaching according to one of 4 types. I went from a 0 to 3 on I know how to deconstruct broad content standards and classroom level learning targets. That's a big area of growth for me. I went from a 1 to 4 in both of the following 2 categories. I base instruction and assessment on clear learning targets, and I translate learning targets into student-friendly language. And a lot of that has come from Stiggins' influence on my life and my teaching practices in my classroom throughout his books. Let's see here. I know how to, this next one is about sound design. So overall, in the sound design category, I scored about 75% was my average of 1, and back in December, and today my average was 3. So in the category, I know how to design or select assessments to serve intended formative and summative purposes, I went from a 1 to a 4. I know how to select the appropriate method to assess each type of learning target, I went from a 1 to a 3. I create assessment plans to map the content of my assessments. I was at a 0 before, and I'm at a 2 today. I'm not always doing it. I'm still in the beginning stages. This is probably one of the weakest areas for me as a teacher. And part of that is just the speed of the classroom, and especially with the past 3 weeks of just end of trimester assessments, those summative assessments have really taken the lion's share of the time in my classroom. Next category underneath sound design is I understand and apply principles of sampling appropriately. I went from a 0 to a 2. I'm still just a novice in this one. I feel like I'm not doing it as much. I still need more understanding in this area. I can write and or select assessment items, tasks, scoring guides, and rubrics that meet standards of quality. I really feel like I went from a 1 on this one to a 3. I feel very comfortable writing the rubrics, but in terms of using them with every assignment, I'm not using them with every assignment. Mostly in ELA, I'm using them for our writing assignments. Very comfortable with those knowledge-based learning targets. Let's see what else here. I create assessment plans. I talked about that one. I recognize and avoid sources of bias that can distort assessment results. This has been a big area of growth for me. I was at 0 before, and here I am at a 4. There was a recent math question on our benchmark that asked students to answer a question that had to do with something that they didn't use very much. Another one was on our ELA benchmark. There was a writing prompt that asked students to write about vitamin supplements, although the prompt only asked the students to write about vitamins, but the scoring rubric required that they have vitamin supplements in their answer, even though the words vitamin supplements only appeared 3 times in 3 different sources in their writing. And the students had to defend a stance of whether vitamins are good for you or bad. And most of my students at my inner city Title I school do not take vitamin supplements. When I polled them after scoring the first 8 kids' rubrics the next day, I went back to school and asked how many of them use them. Only 2 out of 27 of my students said they even use them. I asked how many of them know what a vitamin supplement is, and only 5 of my students could answer it correctly. So they needed an understanding of what it was. So that was definitely a biased question. So also, final one, I know how to apply formative assessment practices within each assessment method. And I went from a 0 to a 3 on this one. Effective communication, it's all fours. My students are highly involved now in getting feedback. I'm doing the feed up, feedback, and feed forward process with my students. That has been a big part of growth for me. And I think it was Brookhart who spoke about this, wrote about this in her books. About rubrics and coming out of my AAL 654 class, the ability to tell those students where we're going, give them feedback in the middle of our work as in their formative, after a formative assessment, using assessments for learning, and then feeding them forward with here's what you need to do next in order to be successful, or maybe even better at times, asking the student what do they think they can do to improve in their work, whether it be working on a certain standard in math, certain learning objective there, or a certain learning objective in our ELA writing time. Those are some things that have really changed in my classroom as a result of the work we did primarily in 652 and 654. Recording and combining a summative and formative assessment for calculating grades that, to accurately communicate the level of individual student achievement at any point in time. That's also for parent conferences. Those are going on. Offer students effective feedback during their learning. That happens daily. I poll every student for math every day in my class. The area where I could use the most growth and still my weakest area was in student involvement. And that primarily had to do with students tracking their own goal, making goals and tracking goals. And while I just got something from Teachers Pay Teachers, one of my colleagues showed me, that's a part of my classroom practice that I want to improve in order to have my students growing as I'm trying to transfer the responsibility of the learning from me as the teacher onto my students. One of the biggest things I've noticed in my classroom in the past 5 years as a teacher, but especially these past 2 years at the school I'm teaching at now, which is an inner city Title I school in North Sacramento, is that those students who do well in 6th grade, they have an internal locus of control. They are driven, they're motivated by something inside of them to do well in school. I have other students whom their motivation is truly external. And I have found, though, that through using these rubrics that we're creating as part of our coursework in 656, it's transferring the ownership of the learning from me to my students. No longer students just raising their hand and saying, I need help. How do I write the next sentence in my writing? Rather, I'm pointing them to the rubric and saying, well, what do you think you can do? Where do you think your writing is at on the rubric? And it's really changed the way my students are interacting with their writing um, in ELA and in our history class. Let's see what else is there. I'd say probably another big takeaway for me so far throughout the program of the assessment literate teacher has been creating rubrics that are based on the standards but written in student-friendly language. My students had a lot of success at the end of trimester number 2, which we just wrapped up last week, in their writing because I was able to create a very student-friendly worded rubric in helping my students create and write their persuasive essays. Now, I gave that out late in the process for my students, but again, what it did to my students is no longer were their hands being raised saying, Mr. Garcia, will you help me do this? Mr. Garcia, can you help me do that? Mr. Garcia, can you edit my work? Mr. Garcia. And it really became a process for them to figure out where they were at. I then took all of their work home with me, graded over a 4 or 5 hour period reading essays, writing comments down in a Google Doc and all their own Google Docs for them, punctuation marks. I just really gave a ton of feedback to all my students and let them resubmit that assignment as many times as they wanted to that week in class. My high students were already rather high, but really who it helped was my low students, especially my English language learners who were on the cusp of that low to mid range. And I saw students go from one boy, one of my lowest, from a 3 out of 10 on the rubric to a 6 out of 10 on the rubric. And primarily where he was losing points was in his conventions of writing. So it wasn't even the formatting of what was needed. Another student went from a 4 to an 8 in her writing using that rubric as a guide for her and the feedback that I gave to her. So that all speaks to creating the rubric, writing something in student-friendly language, taking that learning objective based from the California state standards and saying maybe what I have in my own curriculum isn't enough for what the Common Core standard requires for my students. Also, the process of feeding, uh, feeding up, feeding back, and feeding forward with my students throughout that really improved my students' writing to the place where the average score in my class on our writing was a passing score for our trimester 2 benchmark for grade 6. Those are all my biggest thoughts about the things I've learned in this coursework and how it's applied directly to my classroom for my assessment evaluation and my growth as an assessment literate educator.